So this is our third day on Hume, and today we're going to be looking at the implications that he thinks his idea of causation has for the idea of free will in human beings. And you can see this as a direct response to John Locke's account of how we derive our idea of power and substance from complex ideas, because Hume thinks all of our ideas are merely paler copies of impressions. He won't be able to find any source for that idea of necessity or causal powers, and we've seen already that instead it will come from a non-rational habit or sentiment of belief that's produced by constant conjunction and arises from custom and habit. So there are two parts to our discussion today. First, he's going to look and see where our idea of necessary connection comes from, discover that it indeed has no source, and therefore must come merely from custom and habit, and from our experience of constant conjunction. And then he's going to look and see what liberty of the will is on that account, and show that a belief in necessary connection from constant conjunction is no danger at all to our idea of liberty as usually conceived of by common sense. So we'll start with section 7, and you can see sort of the plan that Hume follows. So he has to show, first of all, in part 1, he's going to show that there is no source of our idea of necessary connection in experience. There are no impressions that correspond to it. First, he's going to say it doesn't come from our external experience. Then he's going to say it can't come from our internal experience. And then once he's eliminated any impression that corresponds to the idea of necessary connection, he's going to then say in part 2 that our idea of necessity comes from custom and habit, from constant conjunction, and the sentiment of belief that builds up through that idea of the transference of force and vivacity that we talked about last time. So he starts by saying that our idea of necessary connection can't come from the outside. So he thinks that when we look at individual bodies, we can see no conception of their power. This is part of his argument before about relations of ideas. Whenever we conceive of a cause, we cannot find the effect contained already in it. All we can perceive is the hammer. We don't see the breaking glass contained in the hammer. We don't feel any power, any impression that is the original of the idea of power. So all we see from the outside are the constant conjunction of events. We have no impression that corresponds to necessary connection or the power that produces those things. Remember, Locke thought that when we saw that our properties connected together, we could form a complex idea of the substance of a thing, the stick-togetherness of that object. But Hume, denying the possibility of such complex ideas, thinks that there is no impression that corresponds to the power or the substance of a natural object, or of the constant conjunction of cause and effect. We might think that the source of that idea of necessary connection comes from the inside, from our own choices. We can see that I decide to do something and my arm rises. Perhaps our idea of necessary connection arises from that. And here's the arguments that Hume gives that are somewhat involved. First, he thinks that the way in which our mind and body are connected is mysterious. We have no experience of my mind actually moving my body. It just so happens that I choose, and then my arm raises up. All I have experience of is the constant conjunction. I don't see how the one affects the other. In fact, secondly, our ability to control our organs is not universal. I can only control some of my bodily actions. I can't control my stomach rumbling or my heart beating, or I can't make my lungs stop breathing. And of course, during times of illness or infirmity, or when we're drunk, our ability to control our organs is reduced. So certainly I'm not getting my idea of power from the way in which I can universally and always necessarily control my body. And in fact, thirdly, science tells us that what we originally move when we choose to do something is not my arm. Science tells us that somehow the originating cause is some action in my brain that's conveyed down my nerves. And even less than feeling myself moving my arm, I certainly don't feel my volition, my internal perception of my volition, moving my brain or moving my nerve endings. So really, I have no impression whatsoever of how my choices and my actions, my willing, affects the movement of my body. It's not even the case, you might think, that I get the idea of necessary connection the way I can control my thoughts, and one idea can follow the other. I might say, I'm going to think of this, and then I think of it. But again, we don't really know. We see the constant conjunction of, I say I'm going to think about this and I think of it, or I think of one thing and another thing follows. I don't really know the soul or the secret power of things. Remember, Locke had prepared the way for this by saying, I don't really have an idea of the soul. The only source of my idea of the soul is memory. So Hume is agreeing and say, I don't really know the soul that's causing my ideas. I only see the conjunction of ideas. And just as I can control my body only to a limited degree, so in fact, it's very difficult to control your mind as well. You'll find ideas and thoughts creeping in when you don't want them. Sometimes you'll think of something even when you try not to. If I tell you not to think of a cow right now, you'll find it very difficult to prevent the cow from coming into your mind. What controls our ideas are psychological laws of conjunction, like similarity, contiguity, and cause and effect, not any mysterious power that our mind is exerting. And that command is different at different times. When we're drunk or when we're nervous or anxious, we might find it more difficult to prevent strange ideas from popping into our mind. So we certainly don't get our idea of necessary connection from the way in which our volition can control our mind. Here Hume considers the arguments of some of the Cartesians that we had mentioned, the followers of Descartes, like Malebranche, who was mentioned in the Nadler book, who thought that God was what allowed our mind to control our bodies, and that maybe our source of our idea of necessary connection or power is our idea of how God affects that connection. And Locke finds that, or Hume rather, finds that very implausible. He thinks that, first of all, we have no impression of that, of God causing things in our body, any more than we have impressions of our own power controlling our body or controlling our ideas. He says, reflect upon it, consider it on all sides. Do you find anything in it like this creative power, which raises from nothing a new idea with a kind of fiat and imitates the omnipotence of its maker? So we can't know the power of God upon our ideas either. In fact, Hume is the first person to sort of recognize that our normal idea of free will involves being like God. God was an unmoved mover who started the world, and everything flowed from him. So we think that our ideas, if our volitions start a chain of causation in our body and are completely free, that our volition is in that sense like an unmoved mover, a first act which is yet uncaused, but which causes our thoughts or causes our actions. And he thinks that we have absolutely no experience of that. There's a famous passage in this section of the inquiry that gives us a preview of what Hume had thought about religion. He didn't publish his works on religion until after his death, posthumously. His dialogues concerning natural religion, one of the greatest and most famous of his works, was finally published. And here we get an example of the type of argument he gives against some of the proofs for God's existence. that God is so separate from our impressions and our ordinary experiences that our mind can't carry itself to that distant region which is so separate from the types of impressions that we actually have. So he says it's carried us quite beyond the reach of our faculties when it leads to conclusions so extraordinary and so remote from common life and experience. We are got into fairyland long ere we have reached the last steps of our theory, and we have no reason to trust our common methods of arguments. Our line is too short to fathom such an immense abyss, Hume says. So in general, Hume's empiricism is going to say that there's no way to develop ideas of God or necessary connection or absolute freedom from our impressions, just as Locke limited our ability to form religious beliefs from our ideas. Hume is going to limit them even further by saying how they can't arise from any impressions that we can make sense of. So it should come as no surprise in part 2 what Hume is going to say is the source of our idea of necessity. There's no rational basis, just as there was no rational basis for cause and effect. The only meaning of our idea of necessity is the experience or impression of constant conjunction. He says all events seem entirely loose and separate. One event follows another, but we can never observe any tie or connection between them. They seem conjoined, but never connected. And as we can have no idea of anything which never appeared in our outward sense or internal sentiment, the necessary conclusion seems to be that we have no idea of connection or power at all, and that those ideas are used without any meaning because they have no impression that corresponds to them. Instead, they are sentiments of belief that come from constant conjunction. Remember again that whenever things are constantly conjoined, are contiguous in space and time, a little bit of the force and vivacity of one is transferred to the other. And when two things are constantly conjoined, when every time we see a hammer strike glass, we see it shatter, after many, many, many conjunctions and unbroken by anything else, we have a very, very powerful sentiment of belief built up to support that. So it's custom and habit and that transference of the sentiment of belief by constant conjunction that accounts for our belief in necessary connection or in the powers of things. It has no rational basis. All right, let's move on to section 8, where he applies this knowledge to the liberty of the will. And here you ought to see what might seem to be sort of a paradox in Hume's position, a paradox that will appear in his discussion of miracles as well, despite the fact that Hume thinks that there's no rational basis for causation. We have no knowledge whatsoever of the source or the power or the necessary connection within things, and that it arises merely from a sentiment that comes from constant conjunction. It's not a rational fact, but as a psychological fact, Hume thinks it's absolutely unassailable and impossible not to believe. So because cause and effect have been so constantly conjoined, we've built up such a powerful sentiment of belief in cause and effect that it's impossible for us to believe that our human will could be free from the type of constant conjunction and causation that we see in the natural world. Likewise, when we get to his essay on miracles, we'll see he thinks that belief in miracles is impossible because it involves believing in something that goes contrary to the accumulated power of all that force and vivacity that's accumulated in the constant conjunction of events throughout our entire experience. So the whole content of our idea of necessity is just the constant conjunction of similar objects and the custom we have to associate them. So he's going to suggest that the same constant conjunction is present in human action. We can predict from the constant conjunction of if I'm hungry, I'll eat. If a child is put in a room with a cookie jar, it will definitely steal some cookies from the jar. And he's also going to say that that customary inference, the belief that human actions are determined, is really necessary, a good thing, because it's necessary for prediction and understanding of human activity. He says not only has the conjunction between motives and voluntary actions is a regular and uniform as that between cause and effect in any part of nature, it's been so universally acknowledged as never been a subject of dispute, either in philosophy or in common life. So he thinks we can't help but believe that human action is determined in exactly the same way that physical things are determined, not by any metaphysical necessary connection that our reason discovers, but by the psychological fact of custom and habit, that we can't help believe that things that have been constantly conjoined will remain constantly conjoined because of this transference of the sentiment of belief, of the force and vivacity. So he thinks not only do we see the same constant conjunction between our actions and desires, we can understand human desires because they always produce the same actions. So he thinks that it's really necessary for us to be determinists about human action and human will, because it's necessary to predict and to understand human activity. If human beings were completely unpredictable and free, we wouldn't be able to understand them and see how they would act under certain conditions. Yet we're very effectively able to see and would come to predict how a person will act because of this constant conjunction and the belief associated with it. Again, we have to stress, we don't know or believe in any metaphysical necessity. We have no idea what causes human actions. All we know is that they've been constantly conjoined with certain motives and desires. And because of that constant conjunction, we have it's a psychological fact that we will believe through custom and habit that all human actions will be determined by their motives in the same way that we believe the sun will rise or that the hammer will break the glass. So if Hume considers some objections, he considers the objection that sometimes we don't know how human beings will act. They never act with complete regularity. And he responds to this in the same way that we respond to scientific exceptions to the rule. And this will be, again, a preview of his argument about miracles. Whenever something acts the way it isn't supposed to, whenever we turn the key of our car, and we've had a long series of constant conjunctions of turning the key and the car starting. When one day we turn the key of the car and it doesn't start, we don't think, oh my gosh, it's a miracle. All of a sudden the law of causal connection is gone. We think that there must be some hidden cause. The battery must be bad, or there's some malfunction that makes it not the same as all of the previous cases in which the car is started. We were led to think of some hidden cause or secret opposition that makes it not the same, because it's impossible for us to believe that it's exactly the same and that it won't act the same. Again, not for any rational reason, but because of the psychological necessity of the power of sentiment, of force and vivacity. It's been transferred to our beliefs by many, many, many constant conjunctions. So he says all men really agree about the necessity of human actions. He thinks that the real reason why people believe in free will is because we feel no connection between our volitions and actions. But we think that we feel a connection. So we think that we feel a connection between external causes, but we're actually mistaken. So just because we have no impression of the connection between our volitions and actions, we feel as though they're free. We can see that there's no rational basis for their connection. But again, we know that the sentiment of belief that similar desires and motives will produce similar actions is impossible to resist. So he says that liberty, what we call liberty or freedom, is not really some mysterious ability to act free from any causation. We have no impression at all about that. Liberty is merely the power to act according to the determinations of the will, and this we all agree we can do unless we're constrained by external forces. So like John Locke, he thinks that what we mean by freedom is just not being constrained, and even if our actions are caused by our motives and our desires, that doesn't mean they're not free. Freedom just means the ability to act in accordance with what we desire to do, in accordance with our motives, and not being determined by something else. So Hume's argument is another example of what we called compatibilism, the belief that free will just means self-determination and doesn't mean freedom from any determination whatsoever. That freedom of the will, or liberty, is compatible with causal determination. And again, Hume thinks, even though there's no rational basis for causal determination, he thinks we can't help believe in it because of the power of that sentiment through custom and habit that arises from constant conjunction. And lastly, Hume tries to argue that instead of the idea that all human actions are determined being harmful, in fact, it's not pernicious at all. In fact, it's necessary for systems of rewards and punishments. If you didn't think that human action was determined by motives, you wouldn't try to alter those motives by changing them through rewards and punishments. In fact, we all, through common sense, believe that people's motives determine their actions. And in fact, that's necessary for us to understand our fellow human being, and necessary for the order of society that uses rewards and punishments to alter people's motives and thereby alter their actions. Actions have moral status, Hume says, because they're the only thing we have impressions of. We don't have any impression of their hidden character, of our soul, or of the secret source of our actions. That's why causation and freedom can have no rational basis. All we have are our impressions of the constant conjunction and that sentiment of belief or expectation that comes from custom and habit. So Hume considers one more objection, which is that if we believe that all human actions are determined, then we're really saying that God is responsible for all actions, including evil actions, if we believe that everything is determined from cause to cause. Hume responds simply by saying that he thinks that even if we believe that all actions flow from a whole which is seen as being all good, he thinks we can still resent and view as crimes the bad parts of that series. So this is, here Hume is suggesting that even if we believed in providence and believed that everything was determined by God, many people could believe that everything was determined by God and yet still think that particular actions were bad and needed punishment, because they would have to be somehow reconciled or absorbed into a bigger picture or a reason that God has for everything. And again, Hume uses his standard response to the idea of God as an objection. Our common sense plainly tells us that freedom is just not being controlled by something external. Our common sense plainly tells us that human motives and desires produce their actions, and we've had a long series of constant conjunctions. The introduction of the idea of God, who is so far removed from our experience and is so difficult and mysterious for us to understand, can't really have much force, can't have much force and vivacity in comparison to the immense force and vivacity that arises from the constant conjunction that comes from the repetition after repetition after repetition of the ordered following of actions from motives, from desires leading to us doing what we will do. So again, Hume thinks that even though causation and necessary connection has no rational basis, psychologically it's impossible for us not to believe it. So he thinks that we don't believe in freedom of the will in any metaphysical sense. He thinks we don't believe in miracles. He thinks that there is no meaning to freedom of the will that can come from impressions. What we mean by freedom of the will is just freedom from external compulsion. And as long as you're able to act according to your desires, then you're free, according to the common usage of that term. And he thinks that our natural sentiment of belief through custom and habit will psychologically make us believe that like effects will follow from like causes, because so much of that sentiment of belief has been transferred by force of vivacity. That's not any rational claim. There is no rational basis for necessity or causation, but it's a psychological fact that human beings believe in universal causation and believe in the determination of human action.